Lancer is called a tabletop role-playing game when you purchase it, although it appears that some people disagree with that assessment. If you review some of the comments on my Lancer shorts, you'll notice a common trend of people who don't believe that Lancer is a role-playing game at all, calling it a war game. Initially, I thought this was a cheeky way of pointing out Lancer's laser focus on combat and tactical play. As time has gone on though, it has become clear that the people talking about the game in this way are entirely serious. I've personally grown frustrated with this discourse over whether Lancer and other similar games are RPGs. Today, I'm going to talk about what these games do differently than strategy war games. We'll dissect what a wargame is, what the purpose of a tactical combat system serves in a TTRPG, and how these things affect Lancer and its ilk. By the end, you should have a clearer idea of why people may enjoy these types of games and why they're still good to keep even if you don't. I wanted to start this discussion off by giving the devil its due. If we're talking about the ways that Lancer is not a war game, I should also discuss why people say it is one. The majority of Lancer's systems are concerned not with the emotions and personality of the pilot, but the customization and combat you do with the mech. In the core book, anyway. This makes it feel like pilots were an afterthought, and the main focus was on making the game a fun combat experience for the players and the GMs to smash robots at one another. I think that's one of the big appeals of Lancer for sure. For as much as people like the world and making their own citizens in it, Lancer is ultimately about having satisfying tactical combat themed around mechs and the fiction that surrounds it. If you're looking for a game where your characters and emotions play a more significant role than the mech they're piloting, then this game may not be for you. Now, before we get into that further, let's try to define what a wargame is and why people are comparing Lancer to one. Wargames began back in the day for armies to test their strategies. The game aspect was meant to simulate the way a war would work. There were even some veteran generals who would advise the players of things they did wrong and try to show them the follies of war, such as misinterpreting missives and weather conditions. These wargames are focused on providing players the experience of running an army and the thrill of battle. Eventually, everyone started playing these wargames, and they developed with the board game hobby over time. Nowadays, wargames are the same as any other game hobby. Some of them are still attempting to simulate real-life wars, but many exist to simulate fantasy or science fiction wars, with the most popular wargame being Warhammer 40k. These games are highly focused on individual matches, where any progression is not permanent. While there are some forms of narrative play in these games, they are often not the point. There's more focus on individual units, armies, and the way they work at a table against another human being. RPGs, on the other hand, are almost never focused on player versus player competition. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson originally built D&D off a wargame base, but it differed in that players were meant to control a singular character. The game focused on navigating a dangerous dungeon, which the Dungeon Master had built. There was a similar player versus player dynamic in that way, however, the Dungeon Master had absolute authority, so it's not like it's a contest. Even heavy role-playing games which focus hard on combat differ from war games, as their combat is focused on providing an experience rather than a contest. Players in an RPG are expected to win most combat encounters, but there's always a loser in match play for war games. The focus is entirely different compared to an RPG. As role-playing evolved, more and more focus was placed not on the dungeon or the situation that the players were thrust into, but the stories they could tell with their characters. This is one of the big things that separated RPGs from other board games at the time. It's also part of what makes them so unique today. No other game will allow you to go wherever you want and build a character story with you and a circle of 4 or 5 other people. This is what the role-playing game has become with time. Yet we still find ourselves talking about combat. With all this talk that the game is focused on providing a unique and interesting narrative experience compared to other games, you might think that D&D has de-emphasized combat over time. Well, it's a bit complicated, but the answer is closer to no than yes. While some editions of D&D are more focused on tactical combat than others, each of them have combat serve as a focal point for the system. Playing almost any other RPG will make it clear how much D&D focuses on making combat an important part of the experience. When we talk about RPGs as a whole and don't assume D&D's own cultural influence, The game is outnumbered by the amount of games which are about doing more narratively focused tasks, telling a story with its mechanics as much as the players want a story to be told. Something like Blades in the Dark is way more interested in heists and getting off of drugs compared to D&D, so I can't really blame the people who believe that these games, which focus on building intense combat systems, are really an outlier in the medium. But they are RPGs. When I think about some of my favorite stories, it's clear that violence is part of all of them, in some way or another. The stories you can tell when your characters are in mortal danger are exciting, since lives are on the line. Despite these stories trying to say something else, they still include violence. Why do they do that? Because violence and conflict are inherent parts of the human experience. People are always struggling with getting along with other people and protecting what's important to them. Historically, this was done through violent conflict when differences could not be amended in other ways. It only makes sense that violence is part of storytelling and works as a metaphor for internal and external struggle with the world around us. That's what makes violence so useful for storytellers. It's something we all can relate to. Conflict, desire, pain, tragedy, it's all part of us in some way. We've either experienced it or administered it. Its place in stories is cemented for as long as all of that is true. Since we can largely agree that violence has a place in stories, it's important now to figure out why tactical combat has a place in games. To do that, we would need to first discuss if the focus on tactical combat and strategy makes the game worse at telling stories. We can consider this using video games like Final Fantasy Tactics, which is a shining example of an excellent story in a very tactical combat-focused game. I'm not going to make this video about Final Fantasy Tactics, but what I will say is that the story and writing of this game are top-notch, while still having an incredibly entertaining combat system, which is very rewarding to go through. We can take the same elements and bring them into our own games. Fights in Final Fantasy Tactics usually serve an additional narrative purpose, introducing a part of the world we haven't seen, introducing a character to the story, or developing those aspects. When we have combat in TTRPGs, it can feel like a formality to get some of that stuff. With tactics, those things are harmonized into a single unit. You begin a fight by having a conversation with the people you're fighting. As you fight, they talk to you about their worldview and why they need you to go down. At the end of fights, you have conversations with people who are affected by it, and you slowly uncover how people perceive your character and your plight. There are very few encounters which happen to just fill space. Even when they do show up, they establish other parts of the world or allow the player to mess with a new tool. Tactics weaving its story into its tactical combat makes both of them appear stronger for being with one another. This is something we can easily port into TTRPGs with little struggle in my imagination. We can still tell some compelling stories while using tactical combat as the core gameplay loop. Even though violence is part of lots of compelling stories, and we can have great stories with tactical combat being a core gameplay focus, there's still the question as to why we would include it in RPGs still. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should, right? Well, here's where I'm going to push back a little. I think it's really awesome that there are games like these ones. They probably take up more oxygen than they should, but ultimately I think variety is great for tabletop role-playing games. Having some games focus on the emotions of your character or their relationships to other people is great. And it's great to have games which focus on preparing the right spells to send some evil archlich to a late grave. We don't need to box in TTRPGs into one thing or the other. We can very easily have it be both and more. There's really light games like Mouse Ritter, and there are really crunchy games like Pathfinder. The space has room for both of these things, right? People should be able to make TTRPGs however they want, and we shouldn't get mad at them for focusing on this part of the experience we personally find boring. I'm not saying we shouldn't grumble sometimes, but undermining the work of a designer by calling their RPG a wargame, and talking about how the characters never matter and it's all about combat is something I really can't get behind. When we look at systems which focus on tactical combat, we can decide whether that tactical combat actually merits inclusion. If we want to tell stories about romance, including a lot of rules about tactical combat doesn't make sense, because it's rare we would have to worry about fighting people. And if we did have to worry about it, it still probably shouldn't be the focus. This is why world building is so important in games. We need to have a narrative reason why the world, and hopefully the players, care about the combat in these games. D&D and Pathfinder work by providing a dangerous world where resources are tough to come by. Tactical combat serves a purpose, because playing better means using fewer resources, which means you can get further along in a dungeon without resting. Now that sort of playstyle has changed quite a bit. But ultimately, this is the reason for tactical combat systems existing in the game. It's to support the idea that smart players can use fewer resources to get farther than players just going through the motions. This means games without something similar to that gameplay conceit would not justify their tactical combat systems very well and need something else to justify them. Now, we can finally look at Lancer and decide if it justifies its need for a tactical combat system. We can start by simply looking at the game's lore and story to see if conflict is something that would come up often. While this isn't a Lancer lore video, it's pretty clear that parts of what the world is going for is the difficulty of doing the right thing in a world where that can constantly change. There's also history upon history of military action done by both the main faction and all the corporations in the game. There seems to be a strong military conflict happening all the time on the worlds outside of the Union core. Violent conflict does seem to be a central part of the setting. Why it needs to be tactical is likely due to the complexity of running these large-scale machines, because tactical strategy games can be fun. While this does make the strategy game element of Lancer make sense in the context of its systems and world, we still need to discuss whether the game can beat the allegations of it being a wargame. When we do that, we have to look at the narrative systems of Lancer. Narrative systems in RPGs are an equal consideration when it comes to balancing the experience you want players to have with the game. Just like some players may not be up to running a tactical combat game, some players aren't up for playing something where there are a lot of rules about player relationships and personal angst. You also have to consider whether the narrative mechanics you put into your game are actually helping the overall design of the game, or just cool ideas you want to put into the game. Lancer then is a game for people who don't want to have a ton of mechanics regarding their personal player character. The core narrative rules in Lancer are sparse. They focus significantly more on building a chassis to get through those scenes as quickly as possible and push the player back into the mech combat part of the game. While this does seem to push the game into the category of wargame for a lot of people, to me, it's really just the writers of Lancer understanding their strengths and not spreading the focus of the game. You can see this in Tom Bloom's other tactical RPG, Icon, which is currently in development. Here, Tom placed a bigger emphasis on narrative mechanics, and as a result, the book is longer, and there are many more rules for the GM to understand. I don't believe Icon is as tightly designed as Lancer as a result of this spread out focus. Tom has also talked about people playing Icon believing that every aspect of the game needs to have equal attention, which is not how he intended to design things with the game. Lancer has fewer of these issues because of its lax approach to the topic of narrative mechanics and design. That said, this conversation becomes strange in our current context. If the claim is that Lancer is a wargame, then we've basically disproven it by having narrative mechanics which are considered a core part of play. Sure, the narrative systems aren't particularly deep, but wargames typically have little to nothing to provide any kind of narrative experience. I've also never heard of a wargame releasing a supplement to give players more narrative-focused rules. Well, save for one. Another thing that makes Lancer definitely an RPG in my books is its focus on player success. All combat in Lancer is built to provide the veneer of challenge. As a GM, you're not typically meant to try and win, but you're meant to provide an exciting experience through combat. Wargames, simply, don't work this way. You're meant to play against an opponent, and there is meant to be a winner and a loser. All units are designed with the capability of winning, whereas Lancer, and other RPGs like it, have enemy units which are designed to be beaten by the players. Enemies have to be designed to seem strong and scary, but ultimately, be defeated. This is actually a much harder design experience than a game where all factions should be about equal in strength. As a result, it's extremely hard to use the word wargame to describe even the combat parts of Lancer, making it clear that when people use this term, they're not trying to point out a miscategorization, they're trying to express their will on the TTRPG space by stating that this game shouldn't be held as an example of these games because of its focus on combat compared to other games in the space. If even the combat doesn't resemble a wargame, then it's time we have a chat about building the community up. I made this video not really to prove that Lancer is not a wargame to people who make that claim. I don't think people sincerely believe that if they're aware of what those words mean. I made this video primarily to talk about some of the design work that goes into making some parts of Lancer. Too often I see people online who are trying to dunk on this game or another game because it has a focus on a single idea or set of mechanics, when that idea or set of mechanics is not to their taste. This happens online in insidious ways, like people who criticize the Avatar TTRPG for not being able to play the Avatar. Playing characters who aren't the avatar was the point of Magpie's design, and informed much of their ideas when making the game. But because some people seem to want one character to completely dominate the entire narrative board, they can't see any of that. This video isn't really about whether Lancer is a wargame. It's about learning and accepting its design, even if it's not something you personally like. Respecting that design and understanding it is the first step to realizing what's something that actually fails to uphold that design, and something that you just personally don't like. In general, I also think it demeans some of the work that Tom Bloom and Miguel Lopez put into Lancer to call it a wargame. There's obviously a lot of work and love put into the game so that it felt like the TTRPG they wanted it to be. To take that work and scoff at its existence is uncalled for. It doesn't help anyone other than the person saying it to feel smart. Finally, it's not a problem for Lancer to be a game where it focuses on combat over narrative. The hobby is full of games. There are a metric ton of games which do the opposite. Lancer doesn't need to be one of them for it to be considered a TTRPG. It always was one. Thanks for watching one of my videos. If you'd like to learn more about Lancer, I have plenty of shorts about it and a long-form video about its economy. Thanks again for all your support. You can find me on Twitch, where I play Final Fantasy Tactics. Blue Sky is my main social media app nowadays, and Patreon is where you can support me so I can continue making videos. Have a great day.